Promising practices for responding to older women who have experienced violence. This learning module will focus on a description of a project by Atira Women's Resource Society entitled Promising Practices Across Canada for Housing Women Who Are Older and Fleeing Abuse. Atira Women's Resource Society supports women and children affected by violence by providing housing, education, and advocacy. The project was designed to reflect older women's lived experiences of abuse, while identifying what these women require to meet their unique needs and circumstances. This module contains 4 learning objectives. 1. Become familiarized with Atira Women's Resource Society and the support and services they provide women affected by violence. 2. Understand what the Promising Practices Project is and how it was developed and implemented. 3. Identify the various unique challenges that older women living with violence may face as described in the Promising Practices Project. 4. Recognize the 11 promising practices for working with older women living with violence. When necessary, you may pause and start this video or refer to linked resources in the description box for further information as they appear. To open the description box, simply click on Show More below the video. At the end of the module, click the link below to be directed to a certificate of completion. The full biography of our presenter, Janice Abbott, is available below. Now let's get started. Our first learning objective is to become familiarized with Atira and the support and services they provide women affected by violence.
So I'm here to talk about a research project that we did over a period of about 4 years. We finished a couple of years ago. The project was called Promising Practice for Housing Women Who Are Older and Fleeing Violence. And I'll start by telling you a little bit about Atira and how we got involved in this. So we're a nonprofit organization, a women's anti-violence organization. We're based in Vancouver, and those are some of the affiliate groups that are with us. So our mission is basically to end all forms of gendered violence, so to do ourselves out of the necessity to be. We envision a world free of inequalities where everyone's human rights are respected and women and girls have the right to participate fully and effectively in all the decisions that affect their lives. We're intersectional or inclusive feminists.
Atira's work is informed by the understanding that women's experiences of systems of oppression, for example, sexism, racism, colonialism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, transphobia, xenophobia, and their identities such as race and sexual orientation are interconnected and cannot be examined separately from one another.
Women-centered. So our work has always been, since 1983, informed by the women who access our services. And in fact, our work with women who are older is informed by the work that we do with women in the transition house movement. We are a harm reduction organization, so all of our services are based somewhere along the harm reduction continuum. We do mostly low barrier stuff, but we also have some treatment and recovery programs for women as well. Innovation. So again, this is about our staff and our women and where we get our ideas and how we move forward and grow. One of the things, this is partly what drove our research project in the beginning, is we believe having a representative staff is the most important action we can take that makes our services accessible. That means when we hire staff, we look for women who actually reflect the women that we're housing and the women who are accessing our services. And we've discovered that early on. I've been at Atira since 1992. And that's just the best way to be able to be accessible and safe for the women who access our services. About 40% of our staff identify as Indigenous or of Indigenous ancestry. We range in age from 21 to 72 years, which is particularly important in this context. About 33% of our staff are women of color, are Black women, so we work really hard to reflect the women who are accessing our services. It's one of our biggest priorities. We speak 50 languages, which is another thing that's really important, including 5 Indigenous languages. It's really important that we have those languages to make our services accessible. We have sites across the Lower Mainland, so I think about 15 or 16 different sites, so we're able to move staff between those sites to accommodate women when we have women who speak languages other than the staff who are on that site. So staff move around. We started out in 2004 with one transition house for women who are older, and that changed. You can see we've added a bunch, and we're working on some more. It's one of the most underserved demographics in Vancouver for sure in terms of finding housing, supportive housing. We have a number under construction. Every single one of the new buildings that we're building has space for women who are older. And we're started to work in the last, since 2013, on intergenerational programs, so partnering women who are older with women who are younger. We used to call them mentorship programs, but we realized that it's a partnership or a mutual relationship, so we changed the language around that. And in particular in the aid of raising up children. So we work with a lot of women who struggle with substance use, who struggle with mental wellness. And one of the things that commonly happens to them, as you likely know, is that their children are stolen by the government, by the system. And so we work in this intergenerational partnership programs to bring aunties and grandmas and mothers and cousins all together to raise up children in a it's that old cliche, it takes a village to raise a child. We know that 95% of the women that we house in the downtown east side of Vancouver grew up in the foster care system, and their struggles with substance use and mental wellness are typically related to lifetimes of trauma. So we're working very hard to change that dynamic and end homelessness, hopefully.
Research has determined that a history of foster care may predict earlier and more severe substance use problems and longer durations of homelessness in adulthood.
We have a bunch of non-residential programs. We recently opened the first women-only safe injection site in the world that we're aware of. Outreach programs. One of the most important things, I'll talk about this in the promising practices, is having outreach specific for women who are older. Takes women who are older a bit longer in our experience to get comfortable with the idea of leaving home and coming to a transition house, and being able to visit is important.
Now that we are familiar with Atira, we can move on to the second learning objective, which is to increase our understanding of the Promising Practices Project and specifically how it was developed and implemented.
So we started in, I want to say, 2011. We started this project working with a community activist in Vancouver, a woman called Jill Hightower, who sort of led us or set us off in the right direction as we went through this project. Jill, I don't know if any of you know Jill. Jill's an academic. She's worked very hard in the violence against women sector, but in particular as she aged in the violence against women who are older sector. So what is the Promising Practices Project? It started as a participatory evaluation of 2 programs. Our program, AMA, which is a transition house for women who are older. AMA is elder sister in a Malaysian dialect, and most of our programs are named sister in one language or another: older sister, younger sister, little sister, big sister, our sisters. We did an evaluation, hired an external evaluation. They looked at the AMA house, and they looked at Sava West in Montreal, 2 very, very different models. AMA is a transition house specifically for women who are over the age of 55. Sava West is more of an outreach or drop-in center in Montreal, and they did have, and I know this ended and hopefully has started up again, but they did have a relationship with a care home where they had access to a couple of beds where they could take women who were fleeing violence. So the emerging practices document was basically an information gathering exercise. Also during that time, we started to develop the Pan-Canadian group of women, or the group of women from across Canada who would sort of lead this project, and identified key principles and practices that led to successful outcomes for those women. All these documents, by the way, are available on our website. And we also produced a national inventory of housing services in Canada for women who are older and fleeing violence. So that was part of the project over 3 years. And then we finished it with an overall evaluation of the project. And again, all of these documents are on our website. We worked to create an inclusive group of women again, which we hope continues to reflect women who are older and accessing transition houses and women's anti-violence and elder abuse services. So we included women who are older. We had representation from both on and off reserve First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women from immigrant women's centers. It was really difficult to find organizations or agencies that were working specifically with women who are older and fleeing violence. There was lots of, well, not lots, but there were a number of organizations working in the area of elder abuse. There were certainly lots of transition house or women's anti-violence organizations, but none that we could find that specifically focused on women. So the part of this document was trying to also get those two sectors together. We had representation from the lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, questioning queer, two-spirit, intersex communities. We really tried hard to have rural, remote, urban representation, so it was a very diverse and, in the end, kind of a bit of an unwieldy group to get together in one place. So we had to do a lot of our work over the phone and by email. One of the challenges in doing this document was identifying things that were specific to women who are older, because a lot of the things we identified as promising practices applied to women of all age groups. So finding things very specific to women who were older was a challenge for us. Yeah, and they're not program policies. So I know when I've done speeches before, people are looking for a set of program policies that they can adopt in their agencies. That's not what these are. They're just sort of overarching ideas that we hope will help guide agencies in developing policies to work with women who are older. The opportunity to spend 3 years connecting with and talking to women who are working in this sector was probably the most meaningful part of this entire project. And one of the challenges we had at the beginning, even though we applied for, we got the grant from New Horizons, we started to recruit women to sit on this committee or this advisory group, was to get women to talk about women. So we had a number of in-person sessions. I can remember having arguments at first in the first session about, no, we're here to talk about women. Yes, older men also get abused or also experience abuse, but this project is about women. And it got to the, and this was even for the women in the room, and it got to the point where I would simply say to everyone, because that question came up every single phone call, every time we got together, is to say, you know what, if you want to do a project on, a very valuable project on promising practices for working with men who are older and experiencing violence, I'll write you a support letter. But we're not talking about this anymore. But that was a constant debate we had through this entire 3-year project. And I still don't know, well, I have some ideas about why it was so hard to be able to focus on women. Make a bit of a diversion from the presentation and tell you how we started this. And our first transition house, called Durant House, which we opened in 1987, is located in a community called South Surrey White Rock, which is about 40 minutes south of the downtown core of Vancouver. It's a city in which I think it's got the highest per capita number of seniors in the country. So it's a retirement community. So we had a transition house in this community where we were seeing a lot of women who were older and a lot of women who were struggling to stay in the transition houses. Transition houses can be very busy, lots of young kids, families, lots of trauma, all of that stuff sort of acting out. And typically a transition house, if you don't know, is a single family home that accommodates 10 women and children. So people share, or women share bedrooms, kids share bedrooms, depending on the configuration of families. And so we were seeing women show up at the transition house and just really struggle to fit into that into that venue, and they would often go home or go back to their abuser, or go back to, it's not always a partner obviously, go back to a landlord who is stealing their money or whatever was happening for them, because they just found the transition house way too chaotic. So in about 2002, we decided that we would seek funding to purchase a house and set up a specialized house. It's actually 2 houses down from Durant House, so we're close, and so there can still be interaction. Nobody really had an interest in funding that transition house, and it was a period in BC where operating subsidies were no longer available. So we got some money from CMHC, which was basically a down payment for this house, borrowed some money from Van City. It was enough to secure financing, be able to service the debt, by women paying rent, which was rent was the equivalent of the maximum, their maximum shelter allowance, which in BC is $375 a month. We decided at that time, based on nothing other than our intuition, that it would just be 6 beds, so that it would be a teeny bit less chaotic, fewer women in the house. We had no money to operate it, so we got a grant from a pharmaceutical company out of Chicago, believe it or not, I have no idea why, called Baxter, who gave us enough money to hire sort of a volunteer coordinator. And for the first 2 years, we ran the transition house using volunteers and this volunteer coordinator that was funded by Baxter. And once a week or so, I would call the minister at that time, or the minister's assistants, and say, you know, why don't you fund it this week? Why don't you fund it this week? And about 3 years into running the house, we finally got operating funding and were able to hire a staff. So that's how we got started.
Moving on to Learning Objective 3, we will now identify the various unique challenges that older women living with violence may face, as described in the Promising Practices project.
So some of the unique challenges: intergenerational or long-term violence. This is not particularly surprising, obviously. Providing and receiving care. A woman who is older and living with violence may be receiving care from or providing care to someone in her family member, including her abuser. Another story I'll tell, we had a woman who was terminal, had cancer. She never came to the transition house, but her long-time husband or partner was torturing her, essentially. She was living in a trailer park. Unfortunately, the neighbors were able to hear it and call the RCMP and call Fraser Health Authority, who called us. So one of the other things is there's a lot of talk about caregiver stress. So a lot of abuse or violence against women is blamed on caregiver stress. And it's often used to rationalize violence against women who are older.
Caregiver stress does not always predict violence against older women. Rather, power and control within a caregiver-older adult relationship is a more important predictor of abuse.
Loss of home. Many women who are older have been living, particularly in rural and remote areas, as we went through this process, have been living in the same home for sometimes 40, 50, 60 years, and leaving that home is a lot harder. Threatened autonomy. Often an abuser will threaten to have a woman put into a care home, or they're afraid to be thought to be crazy because likely through their entire marriage they've been told they were crazy and the violence was their fault. So she's afraid that her decision-making or autonomy will be taken away from her. Financial security. We all know that many women who are older, particularly in this generation, did not work outside of the home. They don't have pensions. They're afraid of losing pensions. Maybe for us, I know in our experience, a lot of women, even though they're eligible, pensions haven't applied. So we spend a lot of time in the transition of homes that we work with women who are older, helping them apply for CPP and OAS. Limited employability skills. They know they're not likely going to be able to get a job. And again, loss of community, and this is particularly hard in immigrant communities or in remote and rural communities. Generational beliefs, the abuser is your child, that's a really big one. Women feel really guilty. They feel responsible for their child's behavior, and they feel responsible to take care of them. So they may not have the support. One of the things we've discovered in our work is often a child won't want the mom to leave because they're afraid they'll have to take over caretaking responsibilities for their father or other adults. So there's often pressure on women to stay for that reason. remote and rural life. Often women who are older have a lot of fear and anxiety about coming out. They've never come out or they're not out. And then a lack of knowledge about transition houses and other services.
We can now look at how these particular concerns and needs of older women shaped the 11 promising practices for working with older women living with violence. The 11 promising practices.
So nurture an environment that values women who are older. This is harder than you think. We have a lot of assumptions and stereotypes about people who are older generally and about women who are older specifically. And it takes a lot of work to get your staff to a place where you're actually valuing their opinions, their input, giving them space, creating opportunities for them to make their own decisions, not thinking they're crazy, being patient if they take too long to explain something to you. That's hard work. It shouldn't be, but it is. Outreach strategies are really important to women who are older. As I said earlier, it's often more difficult for them to come to a transition house. We had to let go of that idea that the transition house in South Surrey White Rock was a secret location. Often women wanted to come, check it out, see it for themselves before they were willing to leave their homes. And have a relationship with the staff to feel comfortable and safe with the staff enough to leave. So providing individualized women-centered support for women who are older. This actually spans across generations, but we left it in because women who are older require different kinds of individualized support. Focus on relationship building. Again, this is important with all women, but it's particularly important with women who are older. We use a term called consistency and predictability across time is what creates safety for women, or that's the message. So you need to be consistent, you need to be predictable. It's not saying yes, it's not being friends, it's about eliminating the chaos from women's lives. So that relationship matters, being patient, taking time, understanding you're not going to be trusted. Just because they've come to stay with you doesn't mean they trust you. There's a lot of things not to trust. Focus on safety. So safety means something different for women who are older. Yes, it's locks on doors and having alarm systems and stuff like that. But again, it's being consistent and predictable. And this is particularly important for women who have lived very chaotic lives for a very long time, chaotic related to the violence in their lives. Facilitate access to health care. So this is important. You have to develop partnerships with the local health authorities, with the clinics. You have to make sure. We had a woman who was quite ill and whose partner had been withholding her medication or giving her medication when he felt she needed it or deserved it or whatever his rationale was. So within about 3 months, her health improved to I'm not a doctor, but improved substantially so she could get up and go out and do things on her own. So having those partnerships with and being able to get women in quickly and doctors and nurse practitioners who specialize in working with seniors is really important. So it's again around strategic partnerships, ensuring women have the opportunity to access the services and help and get the stuff that they need because they won't get it all in the transition house. And they need more time to transition. I spoke of this earlier. It takes a long time for them to get used to the fact they left their home, that they maybe left their children, their abuser, and they just need more time to get comfortable with being away and figuring out what's next. And on top of that, there's not a lot of housing for women who are older to move on to. So they need time to find housing. It's much harder for women to move 2 or 3 times as they get older. So making sure they have a place to go that's potentially a permanent home is really important. Continue to support women who are older after they leave the transition house. So this isn't always necessary or always wanted by women who are younger. But women who are older often feel very isolated. Their friends may not be talking to them. Their children may not be talking to them. So having ongoing outreach is really important. Integrate evaluation into practice. We like to do now developmental evaluations so that we're always changing what we're doing as we hear back from women.
Atira integrates women-centered evaluation into practice in order to achieve a wide range of goals. Women-centered evaluation is central to, among other things, improving or expanding programs for women based on evidence. Let us pause for a moment to reflect on integrating evaluation into practice, including the use of a women-centered evaluation approach. Women-centered evaluation, as detailed in a report by the Vancouver-Richmond Health Board, emphasizes a gendered perspective that ensures the research process and results of the evaluation are communicated in an accessible manner for all women involved. Consider how you could adopt a women-centered approach to evaluation in your own work with older women who are living with violence. How might you involve older women in setting an evaluation agenda? What are some gender-sensitive indicators of older women's health and well-being? What kinds of methodologies might you employ to empower women's voices? Feel free to pause the video and participate in this exercise. You may refer to the Vancouver-Richmond Health Board report on women-centered health and Atira's process and outcome evaluation findings for guidance. Click play when you are ready to listen to Ms. Abbott describe the final promising practice.
And then there's the systemic change. So this has to be part of your work. You have to be not just working individually with women on a day-to-day basis, but working daily for systemic change. And working together. So that means developing partnerships with other women-serving organizations, elder-serving organizations. It means the opportunity. We had hoped it would mean the opportunity to have meetings, to be able to get together, talk amongst each other, develop annual plans. Remember that this document was finished under the Stephen Harper administration, so that certainly didn't happen then, hasn't happened yet, but we'll continue to, we continue to stay in touch through a listserv and are working to try and develop an annual gathering where we can strategize about how we affect systemic change.
There are several important messages that arise from Ms. Abbott's presentation. These include 1. Inclusive, accessible, and women-centered support, advocacy, and housing are critical for older women affected by violence. 2. Promising practices are guiding principles that can be used to influence program policies and should be a first step towards the development of best practices. 3. Older women living with violence may face a variety of unique challenges, including intergenerational or lifelong experiences of violence, for example, abuse from family members including adult children, loss of home and or community, and a lack of knowledge about available services. 4. Promising practices should emphasize the importance of accessibility and women-centered care and research, as well as aim to influence systemic change on the problem of violence against older women. Thank you for completing the learning module, Promising Practices for Responding to Older Women Who Have Experienced Violence. Click the link below to be directed to a short survey and a certificate of completion.